All right, guys. Our next guest is a former UFC title challenger who now does a fantastic job commentating for the UFC, as well as doing interviews and also giving brilliant analysis. One of the brightest and most insightful minds in the sport. He is the outlaw himself, Dan Hardy. Dan, welcome to Submission Radio. It's an honor to finally have you on. How are you?
I'm good. How are you guys?
We're very well. Now, setting the scene here, Dan, it's about 9:30 in the morning, but you're actually joining us from London, I believe, where it's around 10:30 p.m. So you got to tell us, are you normally up at this time, or are you just missing out on a bit of sleep because of Submission Radio? Because I'm very sorry for that.
Oh no, I live on a US pay-per-view schedule, so I'm usually up. The main card starts at 3 a.m. UK time normally,
Jeez.
so I'm up throughout the night a lot of the time. I actually have another interview in a couple of hours' time, so it'll be a late one for me tonight, but I don't mind.
Wow. So you're a madman. You're eating breakfast when most people are going to sleep. Just curious, what are you normally doing at this time? 10:30 p.m., most people are hitting the sack. What's Dan Hardy up to? What's the schedule look like?
I usually like to train around this time. I usually get a training session sometime around 11 to midnight, and then that keeps me awake throughout the fight cards. Often I'm sitting researching. I'm catching up on Eddie Bravo Invitational or Glory or whatever's on Flow Grappling or Box Nation. I'm just watching combat sports most of the time.
How does this affect the personal life? Because we imagine if you're trying to get someone to go on a date with you and you go, hey, I wake up around 10:30, should we grab a coffee around 1:30, 2 a.m. in the morning? How does that work? Does that work out? Do they go with it? Or do you have to just not sleep? Or how does it all work out for you?
Yeah, no, I just kind of have a very unusual lifestyle. So anybody that lives in or around me kind of understands and kind of puts up with me, I guess, is the best way of putting it.
Very nice. Well, we don't have too much time with you, Dan, so we'll get straight into it. Obviously, the reason we brought you on is your fantastic analysis, and we want to talk UFC 217, specifically the main event, and what better way to get into it than take a trip back in time when you yourself fought GSP. You obviously went into that fight, confident, fully prepared, and with a game plan, just like Michael Bisping will this weekend. What would you say surprised you most about George once you were actually in there with him?
I think it was just his timing. I felt like I would be able to at least anticipate when he was thinking about level changing, but it was so quick. And the other thing as well is once he's got his hands on you, he's very good at chaining his takedowns together. So, you stuff the first one and he's immediately started the second stage of the takedown. And, he has 4, 5, 6 options that he can bolt onto the end of it. So that was the thing that surprised me most. And then obviously that affects you in a negative way, because then you're thinking, okay, I've probably got, maybe 1 or 2 punches before he tries to get a hold of me. So then you start holding back and hesitating, and that starts to get very frustrating.
Is this one of the things that you're most curious about in terms of GSP and what he looks like, and that's the timing? Because obviously, when people think about this and him being away for 4 years, a lot of people think, well, cage rust may be a factor, and how's that going to affect his timing, especially against a guy like Michael Bisping, who throws a lot of volume, not to mention, the added weight that he's not really used to carrying. What are your thoughts on that, Dan, and what are you sort of expecting from GSP?
Well, yeah, the weight and the size is the main thing I'm thinking about, and obviously, the work rate of Michael Bisping. He's got such a good gas tank, and he's so good at scrambling back to his feet. I don't think that GSP is going to struggle taking Bisping down at least a couple of times in the first round. I think the issue is holding Bisping down and having the gas tank to support that kind of game plan. Trying to control Michael over 25 minutes is going to be incredibly difficult. I think Michael's going to be a bit more intelligent about his footwork as well. I mean, I was moving straight forward and onto his takedowns. I think Michael will be a bit less aggressive with his attack. I think he'll use more counter striking and try and get GSP to come to him a little bit. Because if you start rushing forward, that's when your level changes. And even though I think GSP will be able to get him down, it's that constant grind of getting back to his feet and then, putting the pressure on GSP when they're on the feet. I think that's where GSP struggles in this one.
And I mean, aside from fighting with Bisping, you've also had the pleasure of fighting with GSP. What am I talking about? Fighting with GSP, you've also had the pleasure of training with Bisping in the past. How would you rate both of their stand-up skills, and who do you think has the edge here? Can GSP win a kickboxing match if he needs to against Bisping, who has, great footwork and has, really impressed in the past?
I think if GSP's going to beat Bisping on the feet, I think he's going to have improved that part of his game. Obviously, he's brought Freddie Roach in, and we don't know what kind of benefit that is going to have. But I certainly think that he needs to show more than he did in the previous part of his career, because it was very much restricted to single punches, a basic 1-2, and then he used the Superman jab low kick quite a lot. And towards the end of his career, there was less and less variety in his attack because he fought safer and safer because he was fighting, the best guys every time he fought. Whereas Bisping, on the other hand, has got a real variety of striking. He's very good at throwing long combinations and attacking various different targets with the same, with the same attack. So I think on the feet, as well as Bisping being the bigger man, I think he's going to be able to push George. I think George has to rely on his wrestling at least to tie Bisping up and slow him down.
It's interesting that you mentioned Freddie Roach because, this is kind of the other big question here as well. Obviously, Freddie Roach, a super accomplished trainer when it comes to boxing, a genius when it comes to boxing, and has worked with George for quite some time. But there's also the factor there that, MMA is very different to boxing. There's a lot of factors to MMA that maybe Freddie doesn't quite understand quite like he does in boxing. Do you think it is a benefit having him in the corner there? Do you think it could maybe be a little bit of a detriment as well?
I certainly think it's an interesting choice. George has always had a real power team in his corner, what with, Faraz and Greg Jackson and Phil Nurse and John Danaher. But interestingly, John Danaher said something the other day in the documentary that the UFC have put out recently about George and his comeback. And he talks about how, although obviously he always had the best coaches around him and they always brought a lot of information to the table, it was George that put it all together. So, I'm sure he's been taught a lot of stuff that wasn't applicable to mixed martial arts in the past, and he's kind of shed what he didn't need and taken what works for him. It's exactly what Bruce Lee said: absorb what is useful and reject what's useless. I'm sure that there is a part of that going on with George and Freddie Roach when he's coaching. I'm sure that a lot of the stuff that Freddie Roach is teaching is very good, but there's definitely going to be stuff that's not going to work for George. But I'll be honest. I worked with Freddie Roach in the lead to the Marcus Davis fight. I used to live around the corner from Wildcard, and I was surprised at how deep his knowledge was about the sport of mixed martial arts. And he actually showed me a few nice little elbow techniques as well. So
nice.
Dirtiest, you could say.
Oh wow, that's awesome. That's a great tidbit of knowledge. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you specifically, Dan, is obviously there's this common notion that, and you mentioned that GSP is going to have to bring something different in terms of his stand up and striking if he does want to win, specifically on the feet. And there's this common notion that you don't really learn much in training camp. You just kind of prepare for your opponent, and that the learning is done out of camp where you're free to explore in training and practice and experiment. So I guess in some sense, do you see that as an advantage? Even though, maybe there will be elements of cage rust, do you think that's an advantage for George, that he's been on the sidelines for 4 years? We don't really know what he's been doing. Maybe he's been learning all sorts of new things. And do you think it is possible for George to come back sort of a new fighter with a new game? Or do you think it's kind of a bit of a mirage where a lot of these older fighters who are on the sidelines, they tend to feel like, we saw with BJ Penn, who felt reinvented, and unfortunately things didn't go his way?
Yeah, it's a strange one. Of course, with 4 years off and with the work rate that GSP has when he's in the gym, I certainly think he can have improved a lot of things about his game. And I'm sure in the gym he does look different and he feels different. And I'm sure his confidence does seem like it's at an all-time high, especially the way that he's been interacting with Bisping in the press conferences and stuff. It does seem like a much more confident George St-Pierre than we've seen before. And I'm sure a lot of that is down to the work that he's done. The difference comes when the pressure's on, when he starts to take shots, when he's had a couple of takedowns stuffed. Does he revert back to the stuff that's most familiar to him? Because that's what the majority of us would do. That fight or flight mode. You go back to the basics, back to the things that are the most comfortable and most familiar. Which obviously for George is a jab and a double leg, as Bisping's been pointing out. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I definitely think he could have added things to his game. There are benefits to taking some time off. I certainly feel, it's been 5 years since I fought last. I certainly feel now, physically I feel better. But, mentally I have a much broader perspective of the sport, and I have a much better appreciation for the development of the sport as well. George will have sat on the outside and absorbed it all, have taken it all in, watched the rise of Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor, and seen the Demetrius Johnson breaking records and reshaping the sport. And George will have taken all that in. It's whether he can translate that to a performance on the night when the pressure's on.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, Dan, because that's the reason why George is coming back. That's a big talking point for a lot of people, because you mentioned that he's seen a lot of stuff happening in the UFC, but then at the same time, a lot of people are bringing up the fact that, he wanted this Bisping fight. He's mentioned that if this fight doesn't go his way, it's likely that he'll retire. And a lot of people are putting it more towards him sort of coming back maybe to make one last paycheck, get a fight where he can win a title, or maybe even go for this Conor McGregor fight. When you hear GSP talk about, retiring if he loses to Bisping, where do you think he's at mentally going into this fight?
I don't know. It's a good question. I think he's testing the water, because I think if he was determined on making a comeback and being the George St-Pierre of old, I think he would have come back at welterweight. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out why he chose Michael Bisping as an opponent instead of Tyron Woodley or anybody else at welterweight. I mean, it would have made sense for him, really, in my eyes, to have come back against someone like Damian Maia, a respected name, someone that's got a fairly predictable game, someone that GSP could have shut down with his wrestling. But Tyron Woodley's a banana skin for anybody because of the way he fights and the power that he has in his hands. And GSP knows that Woodley would back up against the fence and defend his takedowns and try and knock him out with one punch. And that's not the kind of fight that GSP wants to come back for. And the other thing as well is Tyron Woodley's been talking about how he's the greatest welterweight of all time. And if George St-Pierre comes back and loses to Tyron Woodley, it does affect his legacy at welterweight. Whereas losing to Bisping at middleweight doesn't have any effect on the record books in his campaign at welterweight. He's still the greatest welterweight of all time. Even if he does come back and lose to Bisping. But if he comes back and wins, and he doesn't have to force himself down to 170 with a weight cut as well. A lot's changed, including USADA, no IV bags anymore and that kind of thing. So I kind of feel like he's chosen Bisping because he knows he's going to get a high-pressure fighter that's going to be easier to take down than Woodley, that's not necessarily got the knockout power that Woodley's got. And that, if he loses to him, well, he's lost to the middleweight champion and he's still the greatest welterweight. I think it's a very strategic decision, but I'm sure there's a lot of thought that's gone into it.
I guess the biggest criticism from other fighters in the middleweight division is if GSP wins and does become the champion, they feel, because he wasn't a middleweight originally and he jumped the queue in a lot of ways to get this title shot, they feel like if he wins the title, he should, retain the title and defend the title. Do you think there's an obligation there, if he has jumped the queue, has come back against Michael Bisping, for him to at least defend the title once if he does win it this weekend?
Yeah, well, I mean, he said himself in his contract for the title fight against Bisping that it's in there that he defends against Whittaker immediately afterwards. And I think that he would. I think he would take a fight against Whittaker. Against someone like Rockhold, I don't think he would. I think he would rather relinquish the belt and maybe go for Woodley. But I think alternatively, I think he may fight Bisping, and if he wins and takes the belt, I think he'll challenge Tyron Woodley straight away. He comes back, he fights twice, he wins 2 belts, and then he retires. That's a good gamble in my eyes.
You also got to remember the Conor McGregor fight that a lot of people have been throwing out around, and you got to think the UFC would want that fight. Do you think that's sort of in the cards? Even though it seems like George doesn't want to call out McGregor because obviously McGregor being a smaller guy, do you think that's something on the horizon, especially with GSP talking about, the stock market, whose stock is an all-time high, which, certainly fits for McGregor?
I certainly think there's a conversation around it. I think the weight would be the issue. Conor's a big lightweight. I think he's 5'8", 5'9", but he's got a long reach. But then, he just doesn't have the muscle mass that GSP's got now. If you've seen, the recent photos of GSP, he's much bigger than he was at welterweight, and even the old GSP was much bigger than Conor McGregor. So I think that there are a lot of advantages that Conor gives up against GSP, and that power is not transferable really against bigger guys. I think I mean, obviously it would sell a lot. It would sell a lot of tickets, but I just don't. I don't think it makes any sense. I think Conor could really solidify himself as one of the best in the world by just sticking around at lightweight and beating some of the monsters there. To fight GSP, doesn't really gain a great deal from it, and I don't think GSP does either.
Well, while we're talking, I mean, we spoke about GSP's legacy, but we have to talk about Michael Bisping for a second, because this man has beaten guys like Luke Rockhold, Anderson Silva, Dan Henderson, and now he's fighting GSP. If Bisping does win this weekend, what do you think it does for his legacy? I know a lot of people are negative about the fact, that it is a welterweight moving up to middleweight, but still, this is a guy in GSP that a lot of people thought, was the GOAT for a really long time.
Yeah, I don't think Bisping gets as much credit as he should, really. I remember calling his first fight against Luke Rockhold in Australia, and I remember thinking to myself, if he loses this fight, I don't really see why he would continue on. But wow. In Michael Bisping style, he did. That was the one where he got the mounted one-arm guillotine.
Yeah,
and I kind of felt like he didn't look himself. He didn't look like he wanted to be in the fight. But then, he's such a determined individual, and look at him now. The world champion a few months on, and with a win over Anderson Silva, got that win back over Dan Henderson, and showed an immense amount of toughness in both fights. I think it's been an interesting story. It's been a bit of a fairy tale for him to have had the roller coaster career that he did, and to finally get a fight against GSP to add another legend to his record would be amazing for him, and it would be the perfect time to hang him up. But I just, Michael's just such a natural born fighter. I just don't think he could live without it. I think he'll have to wait till his body tells him that he absolutely cannot do it anymore to hang him up.
Absolutely. And I think in a lot of ways, perseverance is kind of the story of Bisping, not only in his fights, but also in his career. And it's just crazy that here he is, the champion, really climbing the pinnacle. Before we let you go, Dan, obviously we want to get a couple of predictions for you. We'll start with the main event, and obviously we want to hear your quick thoughts on the other fights just briefly in terms of predictions. But obviously we're talking about GSP versus Bisping, so let's start with that one, the main event. Who do you think's going over? In your heart of hearts, who are you leaning towards?
I think the safe money is Bisping by decision. I think with the grind that he's got, it wouldn't surprise me if he loses a round or two in the beginning. I certainly think GSP is going to come out and have a strong showing early on, certainly the first couple of rounds. But Bisping's tenacity and conditioning will get him through. And I feel like even if he loses a couple of the early rounds, he'll do enough in the later rounds to make a decision win for himself.
Earlier in the program, Robin Black pretty much broke down TJ Dillashaw versus Cody Garbrandt and made it really clear that this is going to be a super close fight, and it's going to be a super tough one to predict. So at the moment, where are you leaning towards when it comes to that fight? Do you think there'll be a new champion, TJ Dillashaw, or do you think Garbrandt's going to be able to hold on to his title?
I kind of, the closer the fight gets, the more I think like Cody Garbrandt's going to catch him with something. I look at both of their styles, and obviously they're both very talented strikers, but the difference is that Dillashaw needs a number of strikes to do a lot of damage, whereas Cody's got that one-punch knockout power. We saw it against Thomas Almeida. We saw him drop Mizugaki with it. Beautiful short right hand every time. And even, Dominic Cruz felt it with that right hook. I think it was the fourth round of their fight. But then, you look at Dillashaw and you look at his finish over Barao. I mean, that was a lot of punches that he threw, and Barao was still on his feet. And I put Garbrandt in that situation, and I think he's done with 2 or 3 punches in that same situation. So I think that, a win for Dillashaw is much more of a grind than it is for Garbrandt. I think Garbrandt can stand his ground, defend takedowns, kind of hit Dillashaw as he's moving. Just keep clubbing him with that right hand, and eventually something's going to get through. I think if Dillashaw gets the win, he's going to have to work a lot harder for it. He's going to have to really put his striking and wrestling together, and try and ground the fight for as much as possible and stay on top and land some strikes, because sometimes he has a habit of getting drawn into a firefight on the feet, and I think with Garbrandt, he ends up on his knees. It's going to be a tough fight for Dillashaw if he wins.
I agree with you 100%. And even TJ, when he talks about his advantages, he always points to his fight IQ. And I get the feeling that he's subtly trying to say that he's going to be using all elements, especially the grappling, especially trying to take him down as opposed to just stand there and have a firefight. Before we let you go, obviously we got to hear your thoughts on Rose Namajunas challenging Joanna Jedrzejczyk for the women's strawweight belt. What do you think about this one? Do you think Rose has anything new to show Joanna that she hasn't seen before, or do you think Joanna's going to be retaining?
I think it might be a step too far for Rose at this point in her career. She's obviously growing very quickly. She's very technical and well-rounded. But the reason that Joanna stayed on top for so long is because she knows what she's good at and she's built her game around it. She's a world-class Muay Thai fighter. So she's developed a game that allows her to force her opponents into that range. Excellent takedown defense and she looks bigger and stronger since she's brought a nutritionist on board. I really feel like she's preparing for that move to flyweight already. So she's a huge strawweight. You saw that when she fought Jessica Andrade. I think that the way that Rose wins this fight, if she can do it, is to cause chaos, is to be a bit wild, to be a bit reckless. And it's not a smart game plan because it's difficult to maintain that kind of pace for 5 rounds. But I think if she wins, it's not going to be a long game. I think Rose has got to get to the back of Joanna, get her hooks in and look to strangle her, because at any point when Joanna's facing her, she's going to be taking shots.
Well, there you guys go. One of the best commentators and analysts in the game, Dan Hardy. Thank you so much for coming onto the program. Guys, make sure to grab his book. His first book is now out. You can grab it from Amazon, or here in Australia, it's out in bookshops. Go to your bookshop, get it. It's called Part Reptile. It's a fantastic read. And, of course, follow him on Twitter at Dan Hardy, MMA Dan. Thank you for making your submission radio debut on this week, the big week before UFC 217. We're excited to see you in Sydney. Thanks again for coming onto the program.
No problem, guys. It's been good talking to you, and I will see you in Sydney. Catch you later.